Thanks for joining us to discuss the Island Pharmaceutical IPO. My name's Sean Kennedy. I work in the corporate finance team at PAC Partners. Just to introduce you to Dr. Paul McLeeman, the chairman of Island Pharmaceuticals. I'll pass you across to Paul shortly to run through the slide deck. Just as an update, the company, we were looking to raise $7.5 million, looking to IPO tomorrow at 10:30, commencing under the ticker ILA. Had a really successful, roadshow and program. It's been a tough process for subscriptions on this transaction. We were heavily overbid, which has been a very positive sign for the aftermarket. We'll jump into Q&A at the end. So if you'd like to ask any questions, I think there's a facility on this on the Zoom thing. You can type your question in, and we'll run through those towards the end of the call. At the end of the call. So what's Island Pharmaceuticals? It's effectively it's Island's repurposing a molecule, ILA-101, as an antiviral oral drug to treat, mosquito-borne viruses, including dengue fever, Zika virus, and chikungunya, and a bunch of other virus indications. Equatorial, through global warming, you're starting to see mosquitoes expand outside of the equatorial regions, sort of north and south. And what used to traditionally, be a third world problem is now moving into the first world. You're starting to see these diseases turning up on the coast of Florida and the Gulf states, certainly in Northern Australia, Mediterranean regions. It's becoming a larger first world problem. And the guys of the molecule they're about to commence phase 2 trials with to show efficacy. It's a fairly large, fast path to market. This molecule is an ex-J&J molecule. It's been through, 48 clinical trials. It's been shown to be very safe in humans. So we're starting this program at the phase 2 program with some very, very good safety data. And by the sake of that, it's a fairly fast path to market. It's what we're chasing. We've had promising results in humans and animal studies to date. Paul can go into more detail about that shortly. It's a very large target market, as you can guess. I think 80% of the world's population live in the equatorial regions, and that's the market we're chasing. The company's eligible for a priority review voucher. We'll talk about PRVs shortly and the value of those in the secondary market. I think the valuation of the company, it's a well-priced IPO, 12.5 million pre-money. We're raising 7.5, so market cap slightly north of 20 million as of tomorrow morning at 10:30. So platform technology, obviously the core initial focus of this business is chasing the mosquito-borne viruses, but Paul will go into a bit more detail about some future things the company may look at down the track. Exceptionally high profile advisory board. Again, Paul will go into detail further in the presentation. And I think just as one of the seed investors, Bill Garner from Race Oncology, I think he's got a bit of a following in the market. So we've had some pretty good, investor appetite coming out of the Bill Garner network. So I'll pass you across to Dr. Paul McLeeman to run through the presentation, and I'll pipe in again at the end to help out with the Q&A. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Sean. If we can get started on the first slide, that's great. Thank you. Just a bit of my background. I've been involved in drug and diagnostics development for 25 plus years in Australia and elsewhere. Have listed and sat on the boards of companies on the ASX, the NASDAQ, TSX, CSE. Have launched and developed products over my career in a number of jurisdictions, in a number of indications. And also did a short stint in investment banking in Sydney at one stage. By qualification, veterinarian, engineer MBA, and I'll go through the backgrounds of some of my colleagues further through the presentation. So Sean said there's a little bit of repetition in the front bit of this presentation. Unfortunately, I normally co-present this with our CEO, Dr. David Foster. He's unfortunately traveling right now on the way to be with some of our stateside US-based investors, where they're going to gather and join in by Zoom in this brave new world during the listing ceremony tomorrow at the ASX. So as Sean said, we're repurposing a drug that we called ISLA-101. The actual drug name itself is fenretinide. Was developed by Big Pharma as an anti-cancer drug. They did a vast number of clinical trials involving this at both phase 1 and phase 2. They then ceased working on it, and the National Cancer Institutes in the US continued to work on this molecule and took it through a number of other indications. All of those indications were in cancer, one. And as Sean said, an incredibly safe drug, really good handle on the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics of the drug through those studies, so we know how it behaves in the body. So we know it's safe, we know how it's taken up, we know how it's excreted, which is all really important for regulatory reasons. Turns out it just didn't turn out to be a terribly good cancer drug, which has been good for Ireland and also for our new shareholders. As Sean said again, starting to move out of the equatorial regions into temperate regions. And on top of that, there's obviously a vast number of people who travel to those endemic regions, recreational travellers, business travellers, NGOs have a lot of people stationed in these sorts of areas, and also the world's militaries are very excitable about these sorts of diseases as well, because they've got a fairly big standing parts of their armies in these regions as well. So next slide, please, Sean. Thanks. So what are the high points for the company? We can dive into some of these in a little bit more detail later. We're targeting unmet viral diseases. We know that these diseases are important. There's a vast number of people who are at risk from contracting the disease. As Sean said, better than half the world's population are exposed to this annually. There's a lot of cases of these diseases, and they can be quite severe with hospitalizations and in some cases even death. We've touched on the clinical trials. Sean touched on the repurposing, but really that's at the core of our strategy. We're not a from scratch drug development company and don't intend to be one. So while we have programs that are intended to expand our pipeline down the track, we will stay focused around repurposing of drugs where there's a known safety track record. We'll get to the results that lead us to the conclusion that this is worth taking into phase 2 in humans. But as a sidebar comment, we've already had our pre-IND meeting with the FDA. They've reviewed our safety data and our laboratory clinical data, and also agree that this is a drug that should be progressed into humans. So we have the FDA's nod already around the fact that we can proceed into phase 2. They've also reviewed the structure of our phase 2 clinical trial program, and we've agreed that structure with the FDA. So very de-risked from a regulatory standing. Moving into other diseases is a definite possibility, and some of those other diseases, as well as dengue, are eligible for priority review vouchers. So a number of shots on goal, even with our lead molecule, and we'll talk about the team down the track. Next slide, please, Sean. So a large number of people at risk, spreading to other areas. We have data, interestingly, in both a preventative and a treatment mode. So that's important for a drug like this that has the potential to be used in people who are visiting the regions, because we know that in the laboratory we can both prevent and treat the virus in a variety of models. And we've talked about the rest of them. This is a bit repetitive up here because as I said, I co-present this with David. So jumping to the next slide, please, Sean. So the list of diseases, and this isn't an inclusive list, but these are some of our highlights in terms of the impact of the disease on populations. Focused on dengue, it's a very severe disease, affects very large numbers of people. You'll see on the right, there's an estimated 390 million dengue cases a year, and a global impact on the world for those cases of just under $9 billion US, as estimated by the World Health Organization. The sorts of symptoms you see with these diseases is a range of different symptoms, but again, 10% plus of people will end up with a hospital stay, on fluids, on anti-inflammatories, which is the standard of care at the moment because there is no definitive treatment for these diseases. Next slide. In terms of where we see these diseases, dengue is seen right across the tropics, and as Sean said, extending into subtropical and temperate regions. Some of the others are even more temperate still. So West Nile, which has caused significant problems in Australia in animals and humans with a number of deaths, occurs well into temperate regions in a lot of parts of the world. Japanese encephalitis is a fairly severe infection that can cause death in quite a few cases. That extends right up well into the cooler parts of Asia. Yellow fever and Zika are still restricted to the tropics, but Zika again is spreading northwards. into the bottom of Central America and even nudging towards the US. People might remember a Zika outbreak in Brazil some time ago that was around the time of the Rio Olympics. That outbreak caused quite a lot of female athletes and press to not want to travel to Brazil because the Zika, in addition to causing illness in the host patient, if you like, also causes quite severe congenital defects even after that disease has been resolved. So next slide. So in terms of the unmet need, we've touched on dengue, but there's also quite a lot of infections of these other viruses in their localized areas. So Zika is currently experiencing another outbreak in Brazil at the moment. In fact, Brazil's experiencing both the dengue and a Zika outbreak as we speak, which is complicating their COVID response, as you might imagine. Yellow fever and Japanese encephalitis don't affect quite so many people, but they are more lethal diseases. In terms of effective drug therapies that actually treat the virus, there aren't any. Standard of care, as I said before, for dengue is anti-inflammatories and intravenous fluids. And similarly with vaccines, there are some limited vaccines available for some of these diseases, but they either have complications, are poorly tolerated, or have a very narrow label claim. So the dengue fever vaccine, which is currently approved, has a label claim for use in children between the ages of 6 and 16 that live in endemic areas that have a previously confirmed case of dengue fever, which effectively means primary school age and high school age kids in Puerto Rico. That's about it. The anti-malarial drug we see as a proxy for the market opportunity for these drugs. They're not obviously a similar disease in terms of the pathogen, but in terms of where these diseases occur, the severity of the disease, the reach of the mosquitoes that spread both of these diseases and the sorts of people who are likely to be exposed to the disease are very, very similar. And that anti-malarial drug market is expected to reach about $1 billion US by 2026. Just moving on to the next slide. Thanks, Sean. We've probably touched on most of this. Originally a cancer drug, we're repurposing it as an antiviral, different method of action. Demonstrated safe in humans in upwards of 45 clinical studies around the world. There's a little bit of double up in those numbers because some of the studies were done simultaneously in different jurisdictions. But we'll see in a minute where those studies were conducted and what that means in terms of the regulators that have looked at the drug. Suffice to say that regulators on 6 continents, in 6 countries and 1 continent being Europe, have looked at this and agreed that this drug was safe to progress into human clinical trials. That means that we can use the data from some of those studies, and we'll discuss in a minute how we have access to that data, which is really important to us, that we can jump using that data that's been previously used for those other clinical studies means that we can jump straight into a phase 2 human study in New York State. And so we're really standing on the shoulders of very large amounts of money and time that have been expended by other people to develop ISLA 101 to where it is today. Next slide, Sean, please. So in terms of how this drug was discovered, one thing that regulators really like is if you have a very well-known mode of action. Repurposed drugs are sometimes discovered through an aha moment. This drug wasn't discovered in that way. We actually worked with a laboratory at Monash University here in Melbourne who had a high level of expertise in inhibiting what are called NS proteins. They actually were screening known drug libraries against NS protein targets and discovered our molecule. Why is that important? Because it means we know exactly where and how this drug works, and we have a really good handle on what sort of drug levels are going to be needed to impact on it inside the body. In simplistic terms, there's 3 phases of viral replication. The virus has to penetrate the cell, and the COVID vaccines that are currently being rolled out around the world actually act on that part of the viral replication cycle. They're preventing the virus getting into the cell in the first place. The virus then needs to replicate. Viruses effectively hijack the cell and force the host cell to make copies of itself inside the nucleus, so it needs to penetrate the nucleus. It then needs to be exported back outside the cell to then reinfect other cells, and that's called viral export. We're targeting that NS stage, which prevents the virus from penetrating the nucleus, and if it can't penetrate the nucleus, it can't replicate itself and continue with the infection. Next slide, please, Sean. So the data that we're using to move ourselves into phase 2 in these infectious conditions is multifold. We have some initial in vitro models that were done in cell lines at the Monash laboratories to identify the drug. And that has been demonstrated in a number of different diseases. We're focusing on dengue strains 1 to 4. There's four different strains of dengue, and we have data in all 4 of those strains because it's the most impactful, but we have data in the other viruses listed as well. We then took that drug that had been identified, ISLA 101, and actually demonstrated activity in freshly collected human cells. So effectively the target organ, if you like, for this drug is human white blood cells. So we were able to take fresh human white blood cells out of some subjects and show that we could both prevent infection in those fresh human cells and also cure them once we experimentally infected them. So effectively, we've already demonstrated that we can treat human cells that are the target organ, and we're using that to translate that into a human clinical trial. In addition to that human work that was done, there's a very, very severe lethal animal model of dengue. Dengue doesn't normally kill 100% of humans. This model has been developed in rats to kill 100% of the rats. It's a very, very hot virus. And it was done deliberately as an experimental model. It was developed by other companies and the US Army to test dengue vaccine and therapeutic models. In that model, when we pre-treat the rats with ISLA 101, we can prevent the death in 70% of those rat subjects. We have a high level of confidence that it's going to be active in vitro in humans because we know we can treat human cells and we know that we can prevent and treat infection in mammals. Next slide, please, Sean. So in terms of where these historical clinical trials, when it was being developed as an anti-cancer drug, was done, it was done in a number of jurisdictions. As you might imagine, a large number of them were done in the US, so the FDA has seen and reviewed this drug multiple times. But there's also been studies done in Canada, various EU states, individual studies in both Asia and the Middle East, and a number of studies also conducted in Australia. So what that means for us is that the regulators in each of those jurisdictions have reviewed the safety data and agreed that the drug was safe to progress into human clinical trials. Thanks, Sean. So in terms of where we stand today, we're using the column on the left, if you like, as our platform to move into phase 2. And we'll talk a minute as to how we have access to all of that data through the relationships that we have. But we'll be moving straight into phase 2 and then progressing with the rest of the clinical development of the drug from there. So really cutting out at least a decade and many millions of dollars in expended effort on this drug. In terms of where we're going to be creating near-term value for investors, we obviously need to make our drug for our clinical trial. We're just in the mid stages of finalising that with some manufacturers as we speak. We will then use that data to complete our own IND. Our own IND has had quite a lot of money spent on it already and is nearly ready to file pending addition of that manufacturing data. And so we'll be moving quite quickly towards filing our IND with the FDA, and the IND is the next step of our clinical trial process, which will be conducted in the US, as we'll talk about in a second. We'll then obviously be studying to dose patients in that study, and then we'll be having a conclusion of the study and obviously data readout. And we expect all of that to happen reasonably expeditiously, given our study design is actually quite tight. Next slide, please. So in terms of what that study looks like, we have a number of key relationships, as I keep alluding to. We have an agreement with the National Cancer Institutes to access and use the data in their IND, and we've used that in part to populate our IND for filing with the FDA this year. And so that's been really important to us. The other important relationship we have is with the US Army. We have a collaborative research and development agreement with the US Army in this area, so in the development of dengue treatments. That's important to us from a number of standpoints. The US Army has developed a live virus challenge model, which they've run multiple times in the past. That's largely been done at a hospital called Upstate Teaching Hospital in sunny upstate in New York, in Syracuse. So we'll be using that study design. We'll also be using the virus that the US Army owns, which is a dumbed down version of a dengue virus, which is used to experimentally infect humans. And they've experimentally infected humans on, I think, 24 occasions previously. And in fact, they're currently dosing volunteers for observational studies right now. We have an agreement with the Army to access their IND, but we also have an agreement with the US Army to access the patient data that's being developed as we speak. And we'll be using that patient data as our control data in our clinical trial. So we won't need to run that control arm of the study. That's going to save us time and money. And the FDA has already agreed to that trial structure, as I said before. So in our trial, we'll be dosing 4 cohorts of four patients. We'll be pre-treating those volunteers for 3 days and then experimentally infecting them with live virus, and then seeing the response of the body to the virus in terms of fever and pain, some blood factors, and also obviously the viral load itself, and then comparing that to the data from the volunteers that the patient is dosing, that the Army is dosing as we speak. So in effect, the US Army has already started the control arm of our clinical trial. Thanks, Sean. So we've probably touched on some of these already. So we have an agreement with the National Cancer Institutes to access their IND, and the FDA has already seen that data and has agreed to it in a draft IND that we discussed with them in a pre-IND meeting. We have a CRADA with the US Army. We've discussed the implications of that for the company. Very, very important part of our story and our ability to move straight into phase 2. In that IND that we're referencing, the manufacturer that was noted was a manufacturer called Catalent. We also have a manufacturing agreement with Catalent, and it's Catalent that's going to be manufacturing our clinical trial material. So we'll be using the same manufacturer and the same formulation as was used in those other studies. And we have an agreement with a regulatory advisor that's been helping us with various aspects of the clinical and regulatory development of the drug. Once we have an approval in dengue fever, we have then the ability to undertake studies in other disease states and expand that label claim to treat some of those other viruses. And we'll talk about the PRV program in a minute. Thanks, Sean. So the FDA maintains a number of unmet need lists, and these include things like pediatric cancers, a number of other diseases with a high unmet need, but one of their unmet need lists is for tropical diseases. Because of the dengue fever, along with Zika and chikungunya, is on that list. Once we get an approval at FDA for ISLA 101 as a treatment for prevention or treatment of dengue, we'll be eligible to be, well, we will be issued with an instrument called a priority review voucher. This is a program that was instituted by the US government to encourage development in these unmet disease states. What this means is that in addition to getting the approval of ISLA 101, we will get a second voucher that enables the expedited approval of a second drug unrelated to our first program. That cuts about 6 months off the approval time for a second drug. That encourages other people to obviously, including us, to develop new treatments for these unmet diseases. The interesting thing about that program is that these PRVs are transferable and saleable on a secondary market. And indeed, for small companies like us, that's what is usually done, because while it may be valuable for us to get a second drug expedited, it's more valuable for us in the short term to sell this to Big Pharma, because if Big Pharma has their next blockbuster drug coming through that is hypothetically going to have sales of $1 billion a year, which you typically see with the Big Pharma drugs in certain indications, this allows them to get a 6 months earlier sales process. And these vouchers are tradable on a reasonably thick market, and you'll see on the column on the right, they've settled into a pretty consistent secondary value. So once we get an approval, we'll have our first drug obviously available for sale, but we'll also have the ability to sell our PRV and hypothetically get $100 million from Big Pharma for that PRV. Thanks, Sean. We've probably touched on this. We have a collaborative research agreement with Monash to continue work on new drug development, and also to assist us with the fenretinide development. That Monash relationship is very strong, and we have quite regular meetings with them. As part of that program, we'll be screening drug libraries such as Compounds Australia. As a for example, Compounds Australia is a drug library where the background of all of the drugs contained within it are known, so you can selectively choose the drugs to screen as being ones that have already been into human clinical trials, and that library alone, and there are others around the place, has about 4,500 molecules in it. We've probably touched on the other relationships, but I'm happy to answer questions around those later if we get any. But those relationships below are obviously very important for us to be able to jump straight into phase 2, which is quite exciting. Next slide, please. So in terms of IP, we obviously have a patent portfolio. It's around the use of this drug in mosquito-borne viruses. That has had a number of approvals in a number of jurisdictions already. Those jurisdictions you'll see there are important to us given the mosquito-borne nature of our diseases. And it's obviously still under examination in places like the US and other important markets. Access to the investigator brochures and the INDs from the NCI and the Walter Reed Army Research Hospital under that crater are really valuable to us, and that's really the enabling data that's allowing us to move straight into phase 2, as we've said. We're actively looking for new IP, so there's likely to be inventions around things like formulation around this drug to improve the availability of it. And we obviously have a license to that Monash patent that I referenced before. It's a very commercial-friendly license with single-digit royalties, and any milestones are deferred until we commence phase 3. And the research collaboration I've already mentioned to start to develop a pipeline of antiviral drugs, not just mosquito-borne viruses down the track, and we have that in our use of funds statement. Next slide, please, Sean. In terms of the board and board of directors, we've talked about my role as executive chair. As I said, I've been involved in running and developing drugs and diagnostics for well over more than 2 decades here and in the US. David Foster, our CEO, apologises that he can't be here today. As I said before, he's travelling at the moment and is unable to join this call. But again, a little like me, 25 years plus in the life sciences industry, initially on the science side as a PhD in molecular chemistry, but subsequent to that as a patent attorney, and was the lead IP attorney around a couple of really important anti-cancer drugs that were developed by Big Pharma. Has been running his own IP practice in the US now for the last decade, and was one of the founders of the company. So really experienced scientist, but also really experienced in IP law, which is obviously valuable for a company like ourselves. Then I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Anna Lavelle, and as one of our 2 Australian non-executive directors and independent directors. Anna has been a stalwart of the industry in Australia for many, many years, and is currently the chair of Medicines Australia, which is the peak industry group for the pharmaceutical industry in Australia. So very good Canberra connections and very good pharmaceutical industry connections. But prior to that was the CEO of a company of an organisation called AusBiotech, which is the peak life sciences representative body in Australia. And prior to that was the CEO of the Blood Bank and Australian Red Cross, and also has a PhD in genetics. Al Hansen's was one of our US-based directors, currently an investor in life sciences, but has decades of experience in healthcare and investment. Has previously run pharmaceutical manufacturing organisations, so very experienced on the chemistry side and the manufacturing side of the industry. But also prior to that had quite a storied finance career, including a stint as head of one of the departments of the US Treasury. And as a sidebar comment, given our Army contacts, is also a retired captain in the US Army Special Forces. David Brooks is our other Australian non-executive director, very experienced ASX executive, a physician by qualifications, but has been involved in a number of other ASX companies at board level, and and has transacted a number of those companies. You'll see there RHS was transacted to Perkin-Elmer a couple of years ago, which was a successful outcome for the investors of that company, and also founded a very large GP practice chain in South Australia, which recently transacted for 170 million. So a very experienced life science executive, but also very, very talented on the BD side of things. Next slide, please. So Scientific Advisory Board, you'll see it's only a small number of people. It's very much a working board. We're quite a small company, so these guys are actually integrally involved in the company. They're not there just for their name. We do have regular meetings with them, and they'll be guiding and helping the company on both the development of ISLA 101, but also in the selection of potential new diseases that we want to target with our research collaborations. Both Lee Farrell and Simon Tucker were involved for a long time with a company called Biota. Biota was the company that developed the only anti-cancer drug to be approved at FDA out of Australia, a drug called Relenza that was developed to treat influenza. So Lee was involved on the business development side, also managed Biota's relationship with the US military. They had a very large grant from the US military to assist with the development of Relenza. Lee's also been involved in a number of other companies that you will have heard of, both on the development side, but also on the research side of these companies, and has previously worked with one of the very large venture capital firms in Australia, and is a PhD in immunology. Simon Tucker similarly was at Biota. He was the chief scientist there and really took that molecule from bench through to FDA approval. So really experienced in commercial antiviral drug development, but has also had involvement with other programs, including dengue over the years. So really experienced guy, PhD in immunology again, and is going to be really helpful to us in assisting the development of this drug and any future drugs. Stephen Thomas is based at SUNY Upstate, the hospital I mentioned before, where our clinical trial is going to be conducted. Stephen's a really impressive guy. He's joint boarded in internal medicine and infectious diseases. He's head of the infectious diseases group at that university, and was also recently appointed the international principal lead investigator for Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine trial, which is underway. So again, a physician with immunology and virology experience, and is going to be a very important part of our team, advising us on both the current clinical trial study, but also future studies, which will be field studies, and also has Army connections. He was for 20 years a serving captain in the Army Medical Corps, both in the US and in overseas deployments. Next slide, please, Sean. And handing back to you for a couple of slides.
Right, thanks, Paul. Okay, just quickly details of the offer. For those unfamiliar, just let me minimise this. 25 cents a share, raising. We've raised obviously 30 million shares to raise $7.5 million. You can see the metrics there. So market cap at as of commencement of trading is the 20.2 million. Use of funds. And this, I guess, moves back to the news flow I think Paul ran through on slide 17. Should be a fairly news flow rich company in the aftermarket as the guys move towards the efficacy trials for the phase 2 trial, then ultimately, you know, the outcome of that trial and the lead up into it. So majority of capital they're going into the trials. Obviously, some working capital and expenses of the offer associated there. And really, the timetable is kind of irrelevant now because we commence trading tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. stock code ILA. So I guess do we want to move into Q&A now?
See, I have an initial question there from Paul, and while I'm answering that I might let one of our investor relations team, Jane Lowe, just collate any other questions so we don't have double ups. But Paul's asking what are the milestones likely to be over the next 3 to 6 months. I think we've kind of touched on it, but to make that more explicit, obviously our objective is to move into that phase 2 clinical trial as quickly as possible. So there's a number of fairly key value inflection points along the way to get to that. Obviously, we'll be finalising our drug manufacture. That'll be drug substance and drug product. So manufacturing the drug itself, but also then manufacturing the soft gel capsules that'll be used in the study. They'll be material and announceable, and we'll be making that knowledge available to market as we get it. And as I said, we're commencing those discussions to get manufacturing slots with those two manufacturers as we speak. Obviously, we needed the proceeds from the raise to proceed into that manufacturing run. We'll then use that manufacturing data as the final brick, if you like, in our IND filing with the FDA. We need to file that IND in order to move into a phase 2 study in humans in the US, which is what we are doing. Filing of the IND is a pretty big deal. It means the FDA is ticked off on your clinical program and also all the manufacturing and all the preclinical data. So it's basically a nod to everything that we're using to build ourselves into a clinical phase company. There'll be an HREC approval, so human ethics will be needed for the commencement of the trial, and again, that's obviously a material point. So we'll be making it public when we get that ethics approval, and then moving into the trial itself, which should be a reasonably short study given the structure I outlined before. We don't expect any delays in recruitment because we're using volunteers. We're not having to go looking for patients as such, which is what you would normally be doing in a phase 2 study. So it'd be a very quick and efficient study from a phase 2 perspective.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. Well, just a reminder to anybody that would like to ask a question, you can do so using the Q&A function, which is in the Zoom ribbon at the bottom of your screen. We've had a couple of others that have come through. So, Paul, we might start with this one. You've raised 7.5 million. How much runway do you expect that will give you?
The other benefit of that clinical trial structure I outlined before is that the timing for the trial conduct is pretty well characterised. There's often some uncertainty in phase 2 clinical trials, and even more so in phase 3, because you're relying on recruitment and finding and recruiting patients. Because we're doing a volunteer study, again, that study will be really tight. So we've got a pretty good handle on what that study is going to cost us and the timeline for that study. So given all of that, we would expect that the funds raised to date, which will be sufficient to take us through to 2+ years, which will get us out the other side of the clinical trial results, which we anticipate being in sort of about 12 months from now.
Thank you. Okay. Obviously, Sean mentioned earlier, it's been a fairly well subscribed IPO. Question here is, what have you been doing to build aftermarket support?
Doing investor outreach such as today, in fact. So really working to finalise our communication strategy, working on what we're going to be communicating to the market post IPO, and we've got obviously a media and investor communications plan that we'll be executing on to make sure that everybody is kept updated and that we keep the momentum and the interest in the company moving forward. We think it's going to be a pretty exciting story. We see a couple of reasonably interesting comparators in terms of drug repurposing companies in the public markets in Australia. So Race Oncology is doing pretty well at the moment with their drug repurposing program, and Paradigm Biopharmaceuticals would be another similar drug repurposing company where you can see the investor support's been very strong and the news flow has been well received for both of those companies. So really executing on our mission and making sure the market stays appraised of that, and having an open and active investor outreach program moving forward. So not resting on our laurels and making sure that we keep people updated.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So I'll just prompt people again. If you would like to ask a question, drop them into the Q&A. We've probably got time for sort of 2 or 3 more. I've got one here, relates to dengue as an issue. So Paul, can you just recap on how much of a threat it is presently?
So in terms of what's happening on the ground right now, we obviously monitor dengue as a disease pretty closely as a company. There's been some interesting developments too, even just in the last few weeks. So I mentioned Brazil's having all sorts of trouble with dengue, and I think they had eight of their provinces locked down effectively in quarantine to try and spread the disease just recently. So it's causing a lot of harm in Brazil. There's another aspect to dengue that I'll come back to in a minute, which is causing problems as well in some of the Asian countries. There's been a big influx in dengue in returning people in New Zealand, obviously not the last 12 months, but prior to that, there was a very large uptick in people coming from the South Pacific into New Zealand with dengue, and the risk of it spreading then in the North Island. There's been a dengue mosquito discovered in Darwin just in the last couple of weeks. And there's some interesting data that came out of the WA Health Department only about 6 or 12 months ago, demonstrating that it was an increasing problem in fly-in, fly-out workers in the mining and extractive industries in northern WA. So I think for the year in question, which was only quite recently, they saw more than 400 infections in those workers. So it's an increasing problem in really subtropical areas and also from returning passengers. Anywhere where there's a mosquito population has the ability to then become an endemic area. In fact, the Australian Army is very, very worried about Zika in the South Pacific because if you can spread dengue, you can also spread Zika. So it's just a matter of trying to keep it out. But the other problem with dengue, because there's 4 strains of the virus, the first infection can cause hospitalisation, as I said before, and is a pretty serious infection. The problem with having multiple strains of dengue is the body then obviously responds to that first infection, but there's a risk at second infection that the patient can develop what's called hemorrhagic fever, which is a little bit like the COVID-19 cytokine storm that we saw with that virus. And that second infection in about 10% of people can cause hemorrhagic fever. Hemorrhagic fever is quite often lethal. So the second dengue infection can be even more serious, and we're seeing that right now in some of the Asian countries. Singapore has had quite a few cases of hemorrhagic fever in the last little while because they see different strains washing through on a regular basis.
Obviously speaks to the strong need there. We might actually just finish on a further question about dengue with respect to patenting. So dengue has a high incidence in Asia Pacific and South America. Do you need to patent in these markets, and is WHO on board?
So just splitting those 2 questions out, if I may, Nicholas. Yes, we've got patents filed in all of the markets that we'd expect us to. We haven't really filed in any of the sub-equatorial African countries because those countries will be serviced out of other countries where the drug is manufactured, and so that's kind of the important thing, is to make sure you can cover not only where the drug's used but also where the manufacturing is occurring. And in terms of WHO, we don't have any direct involvement with WHO. We have obviously links with other bodies that are important for this, including the militaries. We've spoken to the Australian military as well, but we obviously have quite a close relationship with the US military. WHO is not super important for us right now. At an appropriate time when we have some positive clinical data, it's probably at that time that we'd contemplate having a discussion with WHO if that was productive, but really focused on getting the outcome from our clinical trial before we start to initiate some of those discussions with those global bodies.
Okay, actually, sorry, I know I said that was the last one, but I've just had one more arrive via text. Thanks, Paul Kelly. So when is data due approximately from the time of phase 2 commencement?
So the whole study from where to go, we would anticipate would take less than 6 months, which is very short for a phase 2 clinical trial. There'll then be a period for data cleansing and lock, which is the process of just having an independent third party just go through our data and make sure that it's all valid. That's things like patient consent forms and boring but necessary stuff from clinical trials, which the team's done before many times. And then there'll obviously be a period of statistical analysis. So all up that post-trial period's likely to take sort of circa 3 months. So if you're looking at sub 6 months for the study itself, and then 3 months-ish or sub 3 months for the process of getting to a data read, that would be the timeframes that you would be anticipating. That will obviously all commence once we have both the IND approval and the manufacturing complete. In terms of what you will hear in the middle of the study, you probably won't hear a lot in the study because doing interim reads and interim announcements inside clinical trials is frowned on. It's a bit of a no-no. So no news is good news there during the course of the study itself, but we'll obviously be announcing first patient, we'll announce last patient or volunteer in our case, and then moving through to the analysis of the data and announcing the results to the markets.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Paul. I think we've got through some good ground there. Just a reminder, so Island's listing tomorrow at 10:30 on the ASX under the code ILA. With that, I might hand back to Sean. See you back online and for closing comments.
Great, thanks, Jane. I think any queries, I think people have my contact details, or anyone at Pack Partners, please feel free to give us a call. We can put you in contact with Paul McLean if you'd like to have that have a further discussion. Otherwise, yeah, we'll see you on the bourse tomorrow at 10:30. Thank you. And
David's obviously available as well, if people would like to have a chat with him when he's back online.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time.